So good evening, everyone. We'll wait just a couple seconds for people to filter in. Um, all right, I think we have a quorum. Good evening, everyone, to those who are in the US and especially here on the East Coast. Good morning to those in Asia, and hello to all of those in between. We really appreciate you attending tonight, this 38 North session. I'm Jenny Town. I am the Senior Fellow here at Stimson Center and Director of our Korea program and 38 North. For those of you who are joining us, especially from Korea, we do have translation available, English to Korean. Make sure to check your interpretation button. And so we do want to make this as accessible as possible. For those who don't know us so well, at 38 North, we spend a lot of time really examining North Korea's internal affairs, analyzing how those developments reflect North Korea's thinking and priorities and how it might feed into North Korea's strategic calculus. What are the implications then that might have on North Korea's policies, strategies, and approaches? So tonight we want to look at North Korea's 20 by 10 Rural Industrial Development Initiative. This is one of the signature policies of Kim Jong Un. And this is a campaign to build small industrial bases in 20 rural towns per year for the next 10 years. And it started 2 years ago. So we're about 2 years into this. And this is part of a larger effort to really try and improve the quality of life and resilience of North Korea's rural areas. We've published a number of articles this year on this initiative, and tonight we'll be highlighting some of those findings and discussing some of the larger trends, questions, and expectations for what comes next. So I'm really pleased tonight to share the spotlight with my colleagues from 38 North, and they're going to help walk us through the 20 by 10 initiative. So with me tonight is Ileana Ragnon. She is our research associate and our managing editor for 38 North. She's been with 38 North for about 6 years now, working on a range of critical issues, including North Korea's WMD development and trajectory, implications for US ROC extended deterrence, as well as broader arms racing trends in Northeast Asia, and examining diplomatic strategies to help mitigate those trends. She's also played an integral role in our satellite imagery analysis. Next is Martin Williams. He is one of our senior fellows. His primary interests are in North Korea's technology, infrastructure, broadcasting systems, and propaganda. He recently launched one of our newer initiatives, NK Tech Lab, which is meant to highlight the research, investigations, and data acquired from and about North Korean digital technologies. He has also played an integral role in our satellite imagery analysis. And Rachel Min-Young Lee is another one of our senior fellows. She's also a POSCO fellow with the East-West Center in Hawaii. She just got back from Hawaii. She left beautiful Hawaii to join us back in DC. And at least there's good weather today to welcome her back. But she was a North Korea collection expert and analyst with open source enterprise in the US government, where she wrote on a range of North Korean issues from leadership, domestic politics and economy and foreign policy, to social and cultural developments. She also led the development of North Korea Briefing, which is a new quarterly publication we launched last week for anyone who's interested, really meant to examine notable internal developments in North Korea and their implications. We have a wealth of knowledge here. And before they present, I would like to thank the Uni Korea Foundation, whose generous support has made this research possible and are sponsoring tonight's event. And I would also like to invite the audience, whenever you have questions, to feel free to ask them using the Q&A option, Q&A box, and we will work in those questions throughout the evening. But with that, I am going to turn it over to Ileana to start us off on this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Jenny, so much. And welcome to all of you who are joining. Thanks for tuning in. It's always fun when we get to do a little inter-team conversation and use that as an event. So bear with me for a moment while I share my screen. Here we go. Hopefully that works. All good. Great. So with that, and with Jenny's brief overview of our project and our research and kind of what we're going to talk about tonight, I'm going to be providing a broad strokes overview of the first year of the 20 by 10 initiative and highlight one of the sites that was the first site that was broken ground on as part of this initiative. So despite this past year being the first year of the project, the inspiration for the 20 by 10 regional development plan can actually be traced back to heavy flooding that occurred throughout North Korea during the summer of 2020. In October of that year, Kim Jong Un visited Kimhwa, a place that was heavily impacted by the rainy season. They saw over a meter of rain, a bunch of their infrastructure was damaged, and over 1,000 houses were destroyed. You can see on the map here that Kimhwa is the place with the little green dot towards the south of the country near the North and South Korean border. While Kim Jong Un was visiting the Kimhwa, he called for modernization of local industrial facilities to help the economy and improve people's lives. By the end of 2020, people were moving into new houses in the area, and a set of new factories was inaugurated in 2020. This kind of served as a model for the 20 by 10 initiative. And when Kim Jong Un officially announced the 20 by 10 plan in January 2024 at the Supreme People's Assembly, this was him kind of bringing his past experience with the Kimhwa example to the national scale. When Kim Jong Un returned in February 2024, he commended the impact that the factories were having in the community, but he criticized their layout and the design and how everything kind of flowed together, which presumably we could think informed the structure and the layout of all of the official 20 by 10 project development factories, even though they all vary slightly. As Jenny mentioned, the 20 by 10 plan itself sets out to build local industrial factories in over 20 cities per year over the next 10 years, which is 200 developments total through the course of the initiative. This might sound a little bit ambitious, and it is relatively ambitious, but when you put it in the context of some of North Korea's other development projects, like the one they just closed out on building 50,000 apartments in Pyongyang over 5 years, with that as the backdrop, it seems a little bit more manageable. This project does differ, though, from others in the past in that it's its first with its own official name. It's not just referred to as the Pyongyang Apartment Project or the Rural Development Project. It's branded as 20 by 10, which really elevates it in the state media and national scale. After Kim Jong Un announced the plan in January of 2024, things moved pretty quickly. And what we saw in satellite imagery was indications that land clearance on many sites were visible within about a month of the announcement, and the beginnings of building foundations could be seen as early as the summer of 2024. The first site was Songcheon, which was inaugurated on December 20th, 2024. Most of the rest of the sites from the first year of the plan followed suit in January and February of 2025. By February 11th, 2025, all 20 sites for the plan's first year had been opened, which was just a little bit over a year after the announcement. We're thinking that the Songchan plan or site that was first inaugurated in December of 2024 was pushed to be done in 2024 to highlight that year's success and then kind of move on to 2025 to mark the rest of the projects. So for our research project looking at 20 by 10, as you can see here, we've mapped out the 20 by 10 locations based on what we could see in state media reporting and on satellite imagery. You can tell by the dots. The black dots denote those sites that were from the first year of the initiative, and the red dots denote those that were beginning construction projects for the full 2025 year of the initiative. As the map shows, all of these dots are kind of distributed evenly throughout the country, denoting that it's meant to impact all of North Korea, not just Pyongyang or urban areas like with some past development projects. Where there's a gap in the map is a heavily mountainous area, so it's unlikely that we'll see a lot of development there anyway. The distribution of these 20 by 10 sites are similar to that found in the Rural Development Project that was aimed to build houses in rural areas. So most counties were on the receiving end of these plans and developments. The widespread nature of the 20 by 10 plan means that no matter where you live in North Korea, even if your specific village doesn't have new factories or houses, somewhere nearby does, which contributes to the perception that these types of initiatives started by Kim Jong Un are also for rural areas, not just more urban locales. You can see here Kim Jong Un at the first inauguration or groundbreaking of the Songchon facility. I'm going to highlight this in particular as it is the one that's gotten the most attention from Kim Jong Un. He's traveled there 3 times in total, once in late February 2024 to break ground on the site, which also marked the beginning of the entire project itself. He returned in November of 2024 to observe the construction, and then about a month later in December to inaugurate the site as part of a year-end push. At this site, a foodstuff factory, clothing factory, and daily necessities factory were constructed, which is pretty similar to the rest of the 20 by 10 sites from this year, but I won't get too ahead of myself. Martin will cover all of that in a few minutes. But according to satellite imagery, what we saw was that Songchon was initially a vegetable greenhouse. And according to also a 2015 state media broadcast, this was in part to raise vegetables and other livestock like pigs. And once this initiative got underway, nearly 2/3 of the farm site was cleared and made way for the cluster of factories that you see here. This image was taken on March 11th, 2025, so it was after the inauguration of the site, but a little bit thereafter. And you can see that the farmland that was and the greenhouses that were there before have completely been razed. That was the last site to date that Kim Jong Un has been to, so we're interested to see kind of what else he will attend in the future. But other groundbreakings followed soon hereafter. And like I said, by February, all of them were inaugurated for the first year. So now I'm going to turn it over to Martin, or back to Jenny, to turn it back over to Martin to talk a little bit more about the factories themselves.
Thanks, Ileana. And yeah, with that, Martin, please continue.
All right, thank you very much. Yeah, so we started off with this project trying to find out where all these places were, and then the next thing we wanted to do was build on all the geolocation work done by Ileana to kind of look a little bit more closely at what was being built and exactly where it was being built as well in all of these different rural communities that had been chosen. On all of the 20 sites bar 2, 3 factories were built. There were a couple sites where only 2 factories are built because there were already local factories in the area that didn't need to be replaced. So we found that most of the development across at least 18 of these places was generally between about 15 and 20,000 square meters, in about 1.5 to 2 hectares of land, which was enough to build these 3 factories. This is one example that we looked at here in Tongsing, and you can see that the site they chose was not just agricultural land, but like the site we just saw had a vegetable greenhouse on it. And when the site was built, when the new site was built, you'll see that vegetable greenhouse disappeared. Yeah, there we are. So there's the 3 factories that went up in Tongsing. It's interesting to see that this vegetable greenhouse disappeared. On almost all of the developments, it was agricultural land that had been used to build the factories. The choice of agricultural land, I mean, I think they basically had 2 choices when they were building these. They could build on existing urban land or agricultural land. There is not a lot of spare land around a lot of these places in North Korea. If it's not being used, it's generally turned over to agriculture. So the choice of using agriculture was really against redeveloping existing buildings that stood there, rather than a choice, say, between some vacant land and agricultural land. But it was agricultural land they were destroying. And also in several examples, greenhouse farms as well. This is kind of interesting because one of the projects that they're building is a foodstuff factory in Tongsing here. You can see it in the middle. And the local leaders had been charged with obtaining the raw materials that these factories would use. So they were building a foodstuff factory while, at the same time destroying some of the agricultural facilities in the town itself. The caveat to all of this is that we don't know the condition of those greenhouses. We can't see that kind of level of detail from satellite imagery. So while they were destroying these greenhouses, it might be that those greenhouses were damaged. It might be that they were long since, the end of their useful lives anyway. So perhaps it makes sense that they've done that. The next slide. This is one of the examples in Yomthan where they quite purposely built alongside a vegetable greenhouse. So in this case, the greenhouse survived. But you see the same 3 factories there, still taken over agricultural land, but not at the expense of the vegetable greenhouse. And this is one of the larger projects we saw, not because the factories were particularly large. It's the same 3 factories that we see in all of the other locations, but because this was an example of the 2010 plan kind of meshing with North Korea's ongoing rural development plan that has been building new housing units in a lot of rural communities across the country. In all of the towns we looked at, it was just factories that went up, but in Kumya here, then we saw new housing going up alongside the 3 factories. A lot of that housing will either be for local farm workers or for people that work in these factories. So, that was a fairly standard development going on across the country, roughly the same amount of land in all of these places. Interestingly, if we look at the architectural design, it is different in almost every town. These are not regular factories. There's not a design for a foodstuff factory that was repeated 20 times across the country. This one here, you can see in Oncheon as well. Greenhouses saved on the left, but these factories look very different from the ones we just looked at in Kumya. So while the factories are producing the same type of material, there is definitely, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach. Different factories are going in, and then we started looking at what the factories were producing, and we found out that while they were all generally producing roughly the same types of things, there were definitely variations. So when the factories were open, in each of the factories, North Korean TV did a big sort of 20-minute news report each night every time one of these towns opened their factories, and they gave us a look inside. One of the first questions we always hear with these types of projects is, well, how do you know it's real? How do you know they're really producing things? How do you know it's not just an empty building? We do not know the scale of the production. We do not even know if it's going on today, but at least on the day that it was opened, these factories did have production equipment in there and they were producing things. We see this from these television images. So you can see here some apple juice or apple drinks in one factory here. I think that was in Oncheon Foodstuff Factory. Each of the factories had a little showroom. So this again is Oncheon, and it shows a variety of sort of some of the goods that are being sold there. I can't quite see everything on the shelf, but it looks like, there's some bottled goods there, maybe. I don't know if that's soy sauce in the back, in packets, maybe dried fish or something, some corn snacks, that kind of thing. This appears to be baked goods coming out of an oven. So it wasn't just sort of plastic packaged goods. But baked goods were seen in a couple of factories as well. I think this was in Kujang, possibly fresh bread or cakes or something. That was at the foodstuff factory. There was also a daily necessities factory. Daily necessities is this kind of phrase the North Koreans use for the types of products that are used commonly around houses. So this is a production line for soap, and it wasn't just one type of soap. But soap was common across a lot of the daily necessity factories, but there were a lot of different types of soap as well. This next picture shows several different fragrances of soap that had been produced, again showing people looking around these sort of factories and showrooms there. The next slide shows also more daily necessities, plastic buckets, plastic bowls, that type of thing. Also, we saw some sort of hose and pipe. This is all under this umbrella of daily necessities. And in fact, in the rural development projects where the new houses are going up, When people move into their new houses, they do get a gift from the local Workers' Party. And the gifts that people get as they move into their new houses often includes, when they show the kitchens, a kitchen full of things like buckets and bowls and this type of thing. So this is a very popular commodity in North Korea. And then the other type of factory alongside the food and the daily necessities is a clothing factory. And this just gives an example of, some of the clothes that are shown in some of the different factories. The clothing, again, was not a one style fits all. Each factory seemed to have its own designs, its own styles of clothing. Some of that was also to suit local climates and things like that. So this is some warm clothing here. And I think I'm going to end with the clothing on this photo of these young North Korean children in their fancy new coats that they're apparently, hopefully they were given the coats. Hopefully they didn't just put them on for the picture and have to give them back. But this is another example of the kind of coats that at least state media show were being produced in these factories. And then that was we saw that again and again 20 times each time the factories were opened. The same sort of roughly types of products in each of the three factories. In May this year, there was an expo in Pyongyang, a 2010 expo, and state TV covered it. Interestingly, we couldn't find any coverage in the print media, which is a little bit unusual, and to be honest, I have no explanation why it wouldn't have been covered. But this was on television, and each of the different factories had their own sort of area there. You can see where they're showing things. I think another picture shows, a couple of the different factories here showing a variety of the food that they were doing. When we looked more closely at the food, we did see that there were different brand names on the food. So again, going along with this idea of not being a sort of cookie cutter factory in every town, there is also a different brand, a different kind of local business behind each factory. So it's not this sort of 2010 brand that is producing exactly the same thing in 20 similar factories across the entire country. There is a lot of local initiative involved in these factories, which was interesting to see as well. And then the final slide, or final couple of slides here, one of the things we saw at this expo in Pyongyang, which we hadn't seen in any of the TV coverage when the factories opened, was that it appears that the daily necessities factories are also producing furniture as well. So some examples of some of the furniture that had come from some of the factories. So I hope that gives you an idea about some of the things that the factories were producing. And now I think it's on to Rachel, or maybe back to Jenny and then on to Rachel. I don't know how we're doing this. But on to talk more about the sort of messaging behind some of this and what it all really means.
Yes. Thanks, Martin. And yes, of course, we do have a lot of questions already coming in, which is great, and we will get to those. But before we do, we will move to Rachel, who will kind of put this into context, into broader strategy.
Thank you, Jenny. My colleagues Ileana and Martin have just offered an excellent overview of the economic aspects of the 20 by 10 initiative. I would like to view the 20 by 10 policy within a broader domestic and external policy context. The core of my argument is really twofold. First, this project's primary goal is economic, but it is also motivated by the need for regime survival. And second, it appears to feed into the country's ongoing efforts to prioritize defense development. I will also view the project in connection with North Korea's improving relations with Russia. My colleague Ileana has already provided an overview of the project, so I won't go into the basics of the project, such as its mission. However, I would like to add just two things about the project. First, when Kim Jong Un announced the 20 by 10 policy in January 2024, he indicated he was forging ahead with this new regional development policy despite some pushback from the top Workers' Party leadership. And this is because Kim Jong Un said that some policy leadership departments of the party took a passive attitude toward working on another national economic project in the current economic situation. The 20 by 10 policy was initially focused. The second thing I'd like to mention is that the 20 by 10 policy was initially focused on building food and consumer goods factories, as Martin explained. However, North Korea has expanded its scope over the past year to include fishery bases and quote unquote advanced public health facilities, sci-tech dissemination centers, and grain management facilities across the country in parallel to light industry factories. So we can tell that for Kim Jong Un, the 20 by 10 policy is no longer just about increasing economic productivity, but it is also about closing the educational and cultural gap between Pyongyang residents and those in the rest of the country. Earlier, I mentioned a key driver of this economic project being regime survival. At the end of 2023, Kim Jong Un gave a glowing overview of North Korean economic growth that year, claiming that the country's GDP grew by 40% compared to 2020. South Korea's Bank of Korea also estimated that the North Korean economy grew by 3.1% in 2023, which represented the first year of growth since North Korea closed its borders in 2020. And yet, Kim Jong Un announced the 20 by 10 project just weeks later in early 2024. Why is that? In announcing this new initiative, he said the failure to satisfactorily provide the people in local areas with basic living necessities was a serious political issue. He was more forthcoming and blunt in a speech later that year in September when he said regional development has arisen as a matter of faith in socialism and a very important and urgent matter that has a direct bearing on the future of our revolution. So in short, Kim Jong Un viewed the widening gap between Pyongyang and the rest of the country as the core of the preservation of socialism, which, if not managed well, could have serious repercussions for regime stability in the longer term. The timing of the 20 by 10 initiative's launch in January 2024 is also notable. Kim Jong Un announced this new policy with some months after the North Korea-Russia relationship had reached new heights. So this was after a Russian military delegation led by then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited Pyongyang in July 23 to celebrate Armistice Day and tour a defense exhibition hall with Kim Jong Un. And of course, 2 months after that, Kim Jong Un traveled to the Russian Far East for a summit with Vladimir Putin. The additional income from North Korea's weapons exports and troop dispatch to Russia may have given Kim Jong Un the confidence to start this ambitious 10-year regional development project. Experts have estimated that North Korea has made between $5.5 billion to more than $20 billion from its trade with Russia. North Korea's economic trade with Russia also has increased significantly since 2023. The 20 by 10 policy also may dovetail with Kim Jong Un's renewed interest in the munitions and defense industries. Dual factories are prevalent in North Korea, with the South Korean government estimating that North Korea is operating 300 munitions factories that include weapons production facilities with cover names. So, for example, pig farms, tractor factories, automobile factories. Some of those factories have been identified as dual purpose factories, and 100 civilian factories that can be quickly converted to wartime munitions production sites. So in that vein, it is possible that North Korea intends to use the light industry factories being built as part of the 20 by 10 initiative for munitions and defense production, if and when needed. It is also worth noting that there has been a significant uptick in Kim Jong Un's visits to munitions and defense factories since August 2023, which is shortly after Shoigu visited Pyongyang. On a related note, despite the propaganda fanfare over the 20 by 10 project, national defense remains North Korea's top priority. Between January 2024, when Kim Jong Un announced the 20 by 10 policy, and the end of June 2025, the number of his public appearances related to the military and the munitions and defense sectors was almost twice that of his visits to economic sites during the same period. And this significant gap shows that the regime prioritizes national defense over the civilian economy. And also we can tell from Kim Jong Un's number of speeches where he begins with an emphasis on civilian economic projects, but ending with the importance really at the end of the day of bolstering national defense, because if you don't have strong national defense, you cannot create a stable environment for growing your economy. So this concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Ileana and Martin and Rachel for this great overview of what we've found so far. I do, like I said, there's a lot of questions here, and I have a few questions as well. So we'll kind of mix these in and out as we go along. But one of the recurring themes that we have in the questions, which is also something that we've talked about amongst ourselves as well as we've been doing this research, is now that they're building these factories in these rural areas, is there any sense of how local communities are supposed to get inputs for these factories to keep them running over time? So, can we talk a little bit more about what we know, what we don't know about the sustainability of these, and especially for those that have been built over in the early stages, built over farmlands and greenhouses and stuff, what could the potential impact of that be in the long term on food security in these rural areas? And maybe Martin, we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, definitely good questions. I mean, this is the instruction was sort of put out that local areas, the county or the province, was going to be responsible for finding the raw materials that would go into these factories. If there were any additional instructions on how they were going to do that, they weren't made public in any media that we see. I would imagine that, I mean, it's one of the most important questions with these factories, because you built this whole thing. If you can't get the raw materials, then the factory is going to stop and it's going to be useless. So what was the point of all of this? Also, the local people are going to see that the factory stopped, and they're going to say, well, another useless scheme by the government. So it's a very good question. We know that, North Korea is very resourceful. We know that a lot of the production can get sort of shifted around depending on needs. One of the interesting questions might be how much power local areas have to demand production, especially if there are large national projects going on that demand some of the same raw materials and some of the same ingredients for food and things like that. So it's one of the big questions is, how sustainable are these, and will these actually continue producing goods that go into these local economies and help people's lives, or will these end up being glorified, photo ops that in a year from now the machinery is rusting, either because there's not the raw material or because there's not electricity to run the factories or that kind of thing. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult for us to see from satellite imagery, but we will keep watching the factories to see, what they look like. The factories in North Korea usually do continue running for quite a long time. We find some very old factories that are still running. So hopefully for the people in these areas, these things will have legs and will continue.
Jenny, if I can add. So we know that Kim Jong Un took personal responsibility for this project. And he has committed national resources to making this project a success. So we know that at least for the foreseeable future, he will try to provide funding, right? Central funding. But the expectation at the end of the day is for each region, so each country, a county, and each city to be self-sufficient. So it is really at the end of the day, maybe after that grace period, to look for their own resources to keep these factories up and running. I think so sustainability is, is the big question mark, right? But there is also a possibility that in North Korea, if they find the sustainability of this project to be or if they find this project to be unmanageable, after a few years, I do think that it is possible for them to maybe switch or shift the propaganda a little bit, to maybe refocus on what they have been calling the three core projects. So I talked about how they expanded the scope of the project from economic production facilities, to things like the sci-tech center, the green management facilities, and public health facilities. So it is possible that they could maybe shift the focus to these three areas, going forward. So maybe that's something to keep in mind.
So when you say the three core projects or the three core areas, that's those three that you just mentioned.
Yeah, the public health facilities, the sci-tech centers, and the grain management.
Rather than the originally announced vision of being more foodstuffs and basic needs.
I think it is possible that they may kind of refocus, years down the road when they feel that the project is not sustainable as is.
And we are, like, Martin and Ileana mentioned, we are seeing already some of that shift away from the three factories that all had similar functions in each area to a greater diversity of industrial buildings going in. I think there's lots of questions here. I think one of the questions that comes up for me is really, how does this initiative either add on to or tie into the rural develop initiative that came before it? And so just so we can kind of, again, put this into context, it's not the first rural focused initiative that North Korea's had. So how are these two different? And what makes this one the priority now? Who wants to go?
I mean, I can have a quick go. I think these are they're both interesting because for a long time, most of the development in North Korea has been in Pyongyang. And it seems like as Kim Jong Un has traveled the country, even I think the phrase he used is centuries old backwardness that he's used to describe the rural areas of North Korea. So he's seen these areas and he's realized that they are seriously behind the times. So it's interesting, I think that's why he's put some attention into this, but also probably interesting from a messaging point of view. If you live in a rural area and every day you're seeing new stuff happening in Pyongyang, then that can't be very good for your sort of satisfaction about where you live. And that, I think, kind of ties into these rural development initiatives and what Ileana was saying that we'd found with the distribution of the projects. And particularly what she said that, if this wasn't happening in your town, it was happening in a town nearby. So I think there's a conscious decision not just to do this in rural areas, but to spread it out so that people do at least feel that stuff is happening, even if it's slow, but stuff is happening in their part of the country. And I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much about the plan of it, but that seems to be some of the background to this and kind of how they work together.
Ileana, did you want to add?
Just to add on as something tangible too, I know Martin, in your presentation, you talked about a few instances in which there were rural housing developments right next to the 20 by 10 factories. And I think that's one of the things that will be really interesting to see moving forward, as this plan is 10 years and 10 years is a long time. It will be interesting to see how these two initiatives kind of intersect over time, and if this happens more often where more of the rural housing is next to the factories, and kind of how that plays off one another from there.
And just to clarify, the rural development project is about closing the gap between the cities and the rural villages, right? The farming villages. So it's rural versus urban. The 20 by 10 policy is Pyongyang and the rest of the country.
Can you clarify a little bit of that nuance there of what you mean?
So it's Pyongyang. 20 by 10 is Pyongyang, and so 20 by 10 policy is basically building industrial modernized industrial factories in 20 cities and counties per year, right? Those cities and counties can be like urban,
But
right?
just not
Yeah.
Pyongyang urban.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Versus the
Whereas
rural
rural
development
development
initiative
is,
was very rural focused.
yeah, urban versus rural. Yeah,
Okay.
that would be the key difference.
Great. So one of the questions that comes up is, how did who's building these factories? Is it military mobilization? Is it local workers? Do we have any sense of that?
Yeah, it was, I think, military in most cases. We see before, when the ground clearance begins, one of the first things we see is a little kind of tent village go in alongside one of these. I don't remember the name of the regiment, but I think there was even a specific regiment that had been formed to do this, because one of the early ceremonies, I think the one that Ileana showed, where Kim Jong Un turned up at the groundbreaking, he was sort of ceremonially given over flags to these new regiments. So it's mostly military stuff as well, and maybe there are local people involved as well, but I think it's mostly military.
And so that brings up a follow-up question as to, the military has done a lot of construction work over the years when they haven't actually been fighting a war. But with the number of troops and overseas laborers and now construction corps that are going to overseas, to Russia, to help with war efforts and war reconstruction efforts, post-war reconstruction efforts, or reconstruction efforts in general. Do you think this is going to have an impact on these construction forward projects that are for the domestic audience going forward?
No one's saying anything, so I'll speak again. I don't mean to. Rachel, you go ahead.
I think it's hard to predict, but I have to assume that the Kim Jong Un Kim Jong Un and his associates have calculated that. Certainly, they have a population decline problem, but I do think that when they planned this, they probably thought about the issues that you brought up or that the audience has brought up. And we also have to keep in mind that everyone in North Korea goes to the military. So yeah, like all men, I think even women even have to serve in the military. So we are talking about a large percentage of the population serving the military, and therefore, that they have those resources, the country to divert to these construction projects.
Okay, let's take a little different tact on this. There's a couple of questions, and Rachel, these are probably more for you, that look at sort of how does this reflect broader economic trends? And so one question is, although the 20 by 10 policy is a top-down process, does the fact that it's for these rural communities mean that there's, sorry, it just moved. Does it mean that is there any indication that there's a move towards decentralization of economic, that the regime may be more open to decentralization?
That is a very good question. So this is an upfront investment, central investment for North Korea, right? The ultimate goal is for each location to be responsible for its own economy. So it is a form of decentralization. So yes. In terms of whether that means more decentralization, I don't think so. I think this is part of the broader trend we have seen since Kim Jong Un took power, which is, devolving responsibility to lower units. And I think this actually makes it easier for the central government in Pyongyang to call out certain regions if they're not holding up their end of the bargain. Because the goal clearly at the end of the day is, look, we're investing this much upfront. right now. The rest of it is really up to you. So it lays that groundwork, in my opinion. It doesn't, so again, has to do with the broader trend of devolving responsibility that we have seen since 2012 when Kim Jong Un ascended to power, but it doesn't necessarily mean greater decentralization of the economy.
And certainly then it does build greater expectations and accountability then for the local economies to
For the
feed,
local, yes, for the
feed-
local economic officials, yes.
which is dangerous for those local officials.
Very dangerous.
The second part of that question is, can you elaborate more on the potential anti-market rationale of the 20 by 10 policy?
Well, the anti-market trend is something that we have seen since, I would say, since going back to the collapse of the Hanoi Summit, and made clearer during the 2021 Eighth Party Congress. So I think given everything that we have seen, the market-oriented reform initiatives have slowed down at best, if they have not been stalled, although they haven't gone away. Slowed down or stalled, I would say. And the 20 by 10 policy, some of the things that I mentioned about how it feeds into North Korea's prioritization of national defense over the civilian economy, North Korea's efforts to revitalize the defense and munitions industries, which I think is where this question is coming from. I'm looking at the broader trend of these anti or not anti, but the slowdown of the market-oriented initiatives that we have seen in the past few years, where North Korea is going with its foreign policy, and again, where the regime priorities lie. So it's all of that. And given the prevalence of dual purpose factories in North Korea. And this, of course, is not to say that all of the plant factories or many of the factories being built as part of the 20 by 10 initiative are dual purpose factories, but I think we have to be open to the possibility that given the prevalence of such factories in North Korea, that they can be mobilized for such purposes, especially given the fact that since early 2023, Kim Jong Un's rhetoric about war preparations, combat readiness, those have not gone away. And this is not to say that North Korea is about to start a war, but that rhetoric about subjecting everything to being ready for combat, remains. It's still there.
And certainly at the part of war readiness is the ability to endure a war and not just a battle. And I think there's plenty of discussion these days too about how it fits into that lens of building that resiliency to be able to withstand, conditions if it were to ever get to a situation where there's a prolonged conflict.
Yes, and also the fact that should there be an armed conflict, it would definitely help for each province and each county city to be self-sufficient rather than being reliant on the capital.
Going back to Ileana and Martin, so there's a few questions that ask about, do we know anything about the quality of construction or the conditions working inside? I know that's not necessarily something you can tell from satellite imagery, but are there indicators that give us any sense of that? Has there been any news in some of the media or in the some of the insider accounts from sources like Daily NK or anything about what these factories are like?
I'll start off, and Martin, if you have anything to add, you can jump in. I think this is a really great question and something I think we face talking about any given topic in North Korea, just kind of wondering what's going on the inside of these construction projects. What does it look like? Are they well supplied? Is it building integrity up to some form of a standard? And the unsatisfying answer is we really don't know. And that's goes for many things. But I think it is challenging to tell, all of these factories go up pretty quickly and they're built at speed and at scale, and they're building 20 in a year. And that's a lot of kind of turnover in that sense. I think there have been instances of past economic initiatives. I think about like the Komdok mining project, where we saw buildings and housing and other infrastructure go up quickly after landslides and flooding and erosion. And then the same thing happens all over again. And soon thereafter, things are rebuilt, they're demolished again, and the process has to restart. So I think we really don't know. It's also hard to kind of capture on such a broad scale what the overall life cycle of these factories look like. But that's something that we'll definitely be continuing to keep an eye on and see what the longer term future of this project looks like.
Martin, did you want to add to that at all?
No, I think that was perfect.
Great. Well, Ileana, I'm coming back to you also. Then, as long as you brought it up, what are some of the things that, as we continue to monitor this development, what are we looking for? And what are some of the things we might expect to see?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that we sort of hinted at already is the composition of these clusters of factories. I think 19 of the first 20 all had the same 3 factories, so a foodstuff factory, daily necessities, and clothing. And into the next phase, the second year of the project, we've started to see other things kind of cycled in. We've seen hospitals, we've seen leisure complexes. So it's kind of demonstrating that it's more than just factories, and it kind of might be meeting the needs of any specific individual town or county, or it could just be done in different phases. So it will be really interesting to watch how that evolves, and what other types of infrastructure and community infrastructure are built in to each of the clusters of factories. So I think that's a number one thing. I think another thing that will be really interesting to watch is if the distribution of factories continues to be as widespread throughout the country as it is currently. It will be interesting to watch which other projects Kim Jong Un decides to visit 3 times or more or less. Yeah, so there's a lot of different factors, I think, that we're really excited to see how it all evolves. But primarily just that composition of what each of those look like. Martin, I don't know if you have any others to add.
No, again, I think that wrapped it up.
Well, Martin, let me ask you then a follow-up question, taking just a small step back. When you were looking at the new development in these towns, were these towns generally places that did not have any industrial base to begin with? Or were there generally some factories, but they were really old and this was more a modernization effort? Can you talk a little bit about, is this a from scratch or more so building on?
Yeah, so sort of a little bit of both. As I mentioned, Ileana just mentioned, there weren't 3 factories built everywhere. A couple of places, there were only 2 factories, and that's because one had, I think it was an existing food factory, and the other, I think, was an existing clothing factory. Certainly, these are sort of mid-sized to sort of smaller. They're county seats, is what they are. So they're not the provincial capitals, but they are the county seats in their respective counties. So there is industry in them. It's not widespread. In a few places, we've sort of identified a few of the factories that exist. A lot of times, though, we can just see that there's industry there, and we don't actually know what these factories are and what they're doing. Certainly, though, not a lot of development recently. So these will be, definitely a good step in modernization. As I said, when they were building these and they were choosing farmland, They were not demolishing old factories to build these on. So I think the factories that were there, we can assume were not duplicating this. Otherwise, they might have torn down the old factories to build the new ones.
So it might be interesting to watch for in the coming years as we monitor this project. If they started with the easy ones first, where there was at least some industrial base that they could add to or modernize, whereas, we'll see in some of the later iterations, because they're building 200 factories over 10 years, or two factories in 200 cities over 10 years, whether there are some of these cities that have zero industrial base.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other interesting things is to see how this mix changes. The first year, it was the same 3 factories producing the same 3 things in 18 of the places. The other 2 places had 2 of them. This year, we're seeing a lot of the same thing, but we're seeing some changes already. A couple of places have hospitals going up. We've already mentioned this. Somewhere has, I think, a kind of leisure center going up. So also, yeah, will this sort of change? And was factories the first wave? From next year, will it be 10 new hospitals? And will schools be brought into this? And the kind of definition of, I think, how broad this project goes as well is up for the North Koreans, which gives them a little bit more flexibility, because if they're having trouble building lots of factories, then maybe they can just, if they were planning to build something else, they can just say, well, let's make it part of the 2010 project, and it makes their development easier. We're just going to have to wait and see, and 8 more years to go. So
yeah, and can you comment at all? There's a number of questions here that are really asking about, how well connected are these cities to infrastructure? Like, if they get, are they able to distribute the goods? Are they near rail stations? And maybe Ileana, to the second part of that question is that, is there any pattern of the cities where they're getting this being parts of floodplains, landslides, earthquakes, things that would, where they would need mitigation efforts and stuff? Have we seen any of that so far? Have we seen flooding in any of these cities so far this year with the major rains that have gone through? And again, some of this you might not be able to answer, but let's throw it in there. Martin, let's start with you.
yeah, some of them are on the railway network. I think I remember that in Songcheon, the place where Kim Jong Un visited, I think he turned up in his train, and they took the side off the train, and his car came out the train and drove all the way to the site. It was a big thing. It looked very impressive. So some of them are definitely on the railway network, but at least until recently, I think a lot of the ways that goods have been moved, at least around counties or small areas, has been by road, by truck. The rail is more long distance. So it's a little bit early to kind of figure out if this stuff is really going across the country. Each factory is the idea is that it's to make a small area self-sufficient. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of widespread distribution. So I'm thinking probably truck for all of these. And as county towns, they at least have decent-ish roads connecting them to other county seats in neighboring areas.
And so it should be interesting. Again, one of the things to watch for is if infrastructure improves over time as well as part of this initiative. I know we're running out of time. We have 2 minutes left. We still have tons of questions. We always have more questions than time, which is great. It's great to know that people are interested. Rachel, I do want to throw one over to you. And so there's lots of questions about who's funding this, how is it being funded? And you talked a little bit about, Russia's potential indirect role in enabling this. Is there any indirect role for China?
Oh, definitely. I mean,
We'll
I
give
think
you
a lot of
the last word on this.
Oh, definitely. There is a China role in this, because we know that a lot of the raw materials that are needed for construction come from China. So there is that. But also, I mean, labor is a main component, right, of these construction projects, and that labor is locally sourced. And Despite North Korea's calls for recycling and looking for upping domestic production, I'm not really sure how much of the raw materials needed for construction is actually locally produced. So China definitely has a role.
And do we have a sense of how this is being paid for? Is it the regime finding money?
It's the fundamental question of how does North Korea pay for anything, right? Whether it's imports from China or whether it's about funding its weapons programs.
Yeah, so big gaps in knowledge still,
And more
regardless
for
of
all
how
of us
much we
to learn.
study this. It's always going to be the case with North Korea.
Yes.
And we will continue to dig. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank my team for putting on a fabulous presentation. It's been so great to do this with you. And thank you to everyone for sticking around, asking great questions, and we do hope to see you in the